On September 20th, 1988, a boy named Nurmagomedov was born in the beautiful village of Sildi, in the heart of Dagestan, Russia. Khabib Nurmagomedov is one of the biggest legends of UFC and MMA sports. Khabib got acquainted with martial arts and the world of fighting since he was a child, because his father, Abdulmanaf Nurmagomedov, was one of the famous martial arts trainers. Since Dagestan, Khabib's birthplace, has been involved in war and bloodshed since the distant past, the children of this mountainous region learn martial arts, especially wrestling, from their childhood. Islam Makhachev is Khabib's old friend and teammate, and now Makhachev is also considered the lightweight champion of UFC. His fighting style is similar to Khabib, and Khabib claimed that Islam is even better than him. Khabib's father, who was the coach of both of them, believed that after Khabib, Islam would become the new lightweight champion of UFC, and it happened. In the UFC 280 event in Abu Dhabi, UAE, Makhachev managed to defeat Charles Oliveira in the second round with a unique performance and became the lightweight champion. Khabib fought 16 fights in various organizations from 2008 to 2012, and in 2012, he joined the prestigious UFC organization and won all 13 of his fights in this organization until 2020. Of course, many believe that Khabib's record is not as impressive as it is being talked about. Doubts are raised about his first 16 fights. For example, they say Khabib has collected a good record and resume with unknown fighters, and in fights many of which were 2 rounds, and then entered the UFC. On July 7, 2012, Khabib managed to defeat the Brazilian Gleison Tibau in the UFC 148 event with difficulty and by unanimous decision of the judges. This was Khabib's second fight in UFC. He later mentioned this fight as his hardest fight and said that no matter how hard he tried to knock Tibau down, he could not succeed, and that Tibau's strong body and high power had surprised Khabib. Tibau was considered a grappler, and Khabib was right. On April 19, 2014, it was a turn of Khabib and Brazilian Rafael dos Anjos. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu against Russian Sambo. Khabib, who wins most of his fights in a dominant and one-sided manner, had problems against another Brazilian and felt the danger in some moments of the fight. Khabib was almost dominant in this fight, but dos Anjos had several opportunities to submit Khabib. This fight ended with unanimous vote of the judges at the end of 3 rounds in favor of Khabib. Give up. Give up so you don't get beaten anymore. I'm looking for the championship belt, don't stand in my way. I have to beat you too. These words of Khabib were against his opponent while he was fighting. On November 12, 2016, at the UFC 205 event, Khabib punched Michael Johnson and said these words to him. In this one-sided fight, Khabib managed to submit Kimura Johnson in the 3rd and last round. On December 30th, 2017, at the UFC 219 event, another Brazilian lost his nose hair. This time, the Brazilian of our story was not the king of Jiu-Jitsu. It was the king of Muay Thai. The few blows that Barbosa hit were not enough to knock down the Dagestan Eagle, and Khabib won this one-sided fight by unanimous vote of the judges. Khabib showed a lot of violence in this fight and attacked Barbosa as if he had a personal enmity with him. Maybe Al Iaquinta is the most unlucky opponent of Khabib, because the previous and normal fights were 3 rounds, but the fight for the belt was 5 rounds. So, if Iaquinta didn't give up, he was supposed to be beaten for 5 rounds. Conor, who suspended the UFC after the boxing money fight with Floyd Mayweather, caused the UFC to hold the title fight between Iaquinta and Khabib. On April 7, 2018, at UFC 223, Khabib went 5 full rounds on Iaquinta and beat him. The scene where blood was dripping from Iaquinta's head and face on the ground and Khabib was riding on him and punching him in the face from left and right is one of the most violent scenes in UFC history. At the end of 5 rounds, Khabib won by a unanimous vote of the judges in one of the most interesting fights in the history of fighting. And finally, after 6 years of being in the UFC and consecutive victories, he deservedly became the owner of the lightweight division championship belt. Before we go to the UFC 229 event and the historic fight between Conor McGregor and Khabib, we must review the sidelines before this big fight. Artem Lobov, Conor's friend and teammate and Khabib's compatriot, said in an interview with the Russian media, "But Khabib is a coward," and this word had reached Khabib's ears. Khabib, who was in America to fight Al Iaquinta at the UFC 2023 event, saw Lobov in the lobby of the hotel where the fighters were staying, and they toured him with his friends. Lobov, who was alone between Khabib and his friends, was very scared, and someone filmed all the scenes, and this video reached Conor. Conor considered this bad behavior as a message for himself and quickly flew from Dublin, Ireland to New York, America on a chartered plane and attacked the fighter's bus with a chair. Lobov later said in an interview that first Khabib came to me alone and asked why I called him a coward, and I answered him, if a friend calls you a chicken, what is your reaction? In Russian culture, chicken refers to prisoners who are raped in prison. And Khabib, who didn't have an answer, left. But a few minutes later, he returned with 50 of his friends, and this time he was more aggressive with me. Khabib's bus was carrying fighters scheduled to compete at UFC 223 2 days later, including Rose Namajunas, Michael Chiesa, and Ray Borg. The wheelbarrow thrown by Conor shattered the glass of the bus, and shards injured several fighters, including Michael Chiesa, whose head was severely wounded and bleeding. UFC President Dana White said of the incident, "This is the most disgusting thing that has happened in the history of the UFC." Chiesa was pulled from his fight with Anthony Pettis at the event due to injuries, while Borg was struck by broken glass in his eye, and his fight with Brandon Moreno was also cancelled. Namajunas was also shaken by the incident because it reminded her of several situations that haunted her as a child. She said McGregor later apologized to her, but she did not accept Conor's apology after questioning Conor's behavior. The police arrested Conor, and Conor was in court for several months. Although Artem Lobov was not present in the fighter's bus, his fight with Alex Caceres was also cancelled by the UFC because the UFC considered him one of the main culprits of all these incidents, as well as his involvement in the attack on the bus. And now we come to the biggest event in MMA history, the fourth highest grossing fight in martial arts history with 2.4 million PPV. Khabib Nurmagomedov and Conor McGregor faced each other in the main event of UFC 229, which was held on October 6, 2018, after a busy press conference, and Khabib managed to submit Conor with a neck crank submission in the fourth round. During the fight, when Khabib dominated Conor and was hitting him, he said to Conor, "Come on, talk now. Why silence?" These scenes evoked a fight between Khabib and Michael Johnson. Khabib's submission was not locked on Conor's neck, and Conor had his neck folded so that Khabib could not choke him. But Khabib locked his hand on Conor's jaw and mouth and pressed with all his might to make Conor submit. If Conor had not surrendered, there was a risk of breaking his jaw and neck. When Conor surrendered and Herb Dean, the referee, wanted to separate Khabib, Khabib spat at Conor. Khabib has given many interviews about this fight. For example, he once said that Conor gave up early and Khabib regretted all the training he did for this fight. Later he said, "I didn't think Conor would be so stubborn, and Conor's stubbornness surprised me." Conor won the third round of this fight, and this is the only round that Khabib has lost in all his 29 fights. Before the fight, betting companies overestimated Khabib's chances of winning. After the fight, Khabib, who was chanting in the middle of the octagon, jumped out of the cage and fought with his friend and teammate Conor, Dylan Dennis. It was from here that chaos broke out, and many of Khabib's friends attacked Conor. Khabib was banned. He was not given the belt at the end of the match, and his wages were blocked. Khabib Nurmagomedov was banned from fighting for 9 months as of October 6th. Due to the fight he had with Conor McGregor after the fight. He was required to pay a fine of $500,000. McGregor was suspended for 6 months and fined only $50,000. The scene of presenting the belt to Khabib and the interviews inside the octagon and the press conference after the event could have helped to make Khabib's achievement more historic. But Khabib made a mistake, and he himself admitted his mistake. He said he will surely be punished when he goes to his father. Khabib believed that Conor insulted his father and religion a lot. Conor later complained about Khabib and said all these words are for business, and Khabib took everything too seriously. Anyway, the UFC 229 event was called the most popular combat event in history. Despite the good financial offers that were made to Khabib, he never agreed to a rematch of this fight and refused a huge amount of money. After the end of Khabib's suspension, he returned to the fighting scene, and at the UFC 242 event held on September 7, 2019 in Abu Dhabi, he managed to submit Dustin Poirier in the third round by RNC submission. Khabib cites the moment he was caught in Poirier's guillotine as the hardest moment of his fighting career. After saving himself from Poirier's guillotine, he immediately strangled him. July 3, 2020, the darkest day of Khabib's life. On this day, he lost his father, Habib Nurmagomedov, who was suffering from Corona disease. Habib was 57 years old. Khabib fought his last fight on October 25, 2020 at the UFC 254 event in Abu Dhabi and said goodbye to the world of fighting forever. In this fight, which was held without spectators due to Corona restrictions, Khabib managed to stun Justin Gaethje with a triangle choke submission in the second round. He was able to win his 29th consecutive MMA victory. Roy Gaethje's submission won Khabib the 2020 UFC Best Submission Award. After the fight, he sat down in the middle of the octagon and cried because of his father's death. He announced the reason for his farewell was the death of his father and the promise he made to his mother. He had promised his mother that he would never fight without his father and told his mother that the fight against Gaethje would be his last fight. In all these 29 fights of Khabib, or at least in the 13 fights he fought in the UFC, no one saw Khabib injured or bleeding from his body. He was completely superior to his opponents and humiliated them. Maybe many people don't like Khabib's style and like the style of a fighter like Charles Oliveira, who fights aggressively, but Khabib knew how to overcome all opponents with his own style. After saying goodbye, heavy and tempting offers were made to him to return to the octagon, but Khabib said that my story is over and now it's the turn of others to write their story. Without exaggeration, his position as one of the best fighters in the history of martial arts is reserved forever. Well, all that's left to say is thank you for watching Multimedia. You are a legend. See you in the next video. Cheers.